Hello everybody and welcome to the third round of the American Monoposto Championship. I'm your host Josh Kassar and today we're going to follow the AMC circus to one of the greatest racing venues in the world, the Interlagos Circuit in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Before we get started though, let's take a quick look at the rumours and news surrounding the AMC this year. Bravo Racing has joined the ever-growing AMC field, debuting with two of their three cars in Interlagos. Gabriel Peckley and Jonathan Holohan are going to represent the team in Sao Paulo, while team boss Gustavo Brzezinski is going to miss out on his potential home race. After the safety car was never deployed in Rio despite multiple incidents and stationary cars on track, Simon Core has decided to step down from his streamlined driver role for now and take over the role of live stewarding. It's still unclear whether the AMC admin is actually going to come back to his race seat anytime soon. Drivers had to complete 20 consecutive laps on the practice server before the event even took place. Both Falcon drivers were penalised for not fulfilling this requirement, with some people in the paddock being very unhappy about the decision since they felt an automatic start from the back of the grid or no entry at all for Falcon would have been a more appropriate punishment. After Gonzalez Cativo finished in second place last week in Rio, we decided to chat with Michael Cosbow, the founder of Costech, about the team and its history.
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. Ich
habe mit einem Kumpel den Grand Prix 2 Manager tatsächlich damals gespielt und ich habe einen kurzen Teamnamen mir überlegen wollen. Irgendwie sollte mein Name mit drin sein und dann ist eben aus Technology und den ersten 3 Buchstaben meines Nachnamens dann eben Costech entstanden und so hat sich das dann etabliert.
Yeah, I'm about to fade away, cause every time I wake up I feel like it's Monday. Something's going wrong with all the chemicals up in my brain. All of a sudden I don't look at anything the same way. Gotta build up of my thoughts sitting in an ashtray.
Ich habe relativ früh angefangen Fußballmanager und auch dann eben, als wir den entdeckt haben, Grand Prix 2 Manager zu spielen. Jetzt später dann eben die moderneren dann auch und das war schon immer so eine Leidenschaft, Teams zusammenzustellen, Stärken und Schwächen, die zusammenkommen und die man dann eben zu einem Team sozusagen formen muss. Und so war das schon früh dann die Idee, das auch ins Sim-Racing zu übertragen. Also quasi dann in dem Moment, in dem es auch die Division 2 damals gab, in der RFF, da gab es dann die erste Saison, das war quasi die Nachwuchsklasse, da habe ich dann auch aus meiner Sicht einen sehr guten Fahrer damals, Jan Berberich, verpflichtet, der dann auch Vizemeister geworden ist. Wir haben die Teammeisterschaft gewonnen und schon damals war es so, dass da auch die Personalie Cativo irgendwie mit involviert war und auch teilweise die Leute gemanagt hat, die dann da gefahren sind. Und das war eine sehr interessante und spannende Zeit, in der man sich wirklich gefreut hat, wenn dann die Rennvideos auch wirklich erschienen sind auf dem Channel.
Silhouettes of you are like a taunt. Never really.
Und der Punkt war, dass ich ja auch nicht als Teamchef auftreten wollte, direkt sozusagen mittendrin, weil ich ja auch die Liga noch geleitet hatte und es schon ein bisschen trennen wollte. Das heißt, ich war der Namensgeber, ich war quasi der Teambesitzer, aber ich habe das dann immer anderen Leuten überlassen. Cativo und dann später Max Hellmann und jetzt eben wieder Cativo. In der Teammeisterschaft haben wir auf jeden Fall eine gute Chance, weil ich glaube, dass Kevin halt auf sich allein gestellt ist, größtenteils, was die Punktesammlung angeht. Das hat sich jetzt schon rauskristallisiert. Dann mit Odio, da wird es auch Schwankungen geben. Ich glaube, dass wir ziemlich rock solid da aufgestellt sind. Also Cativo als Ex-Weltmeister, Max Hellmann, der unheimlich schnell ist, aber dann oftmals auch Pech hat. Das können wir dann kompensieren, dadurch, dass Philipp Fekeler immer für gute Resultate gut ist. Und Robin Ida hat auch gezeigt, dass er, wenn andere vielleicht strugglen, dann mal reinspringt und ein gutes Ergebnis holt. Und ich glaube deswegen, dass wir übers Jahr gesehen einfach ein sehr starkes Paket haben, was sehr schwer zu schlagen sein wird. Also ich denke, dass man Kevin Peters auf jeden Fall, was die Konstanz angeht, übers Jahr schwer haben wird zu schlagen. Jetzt ist es ja glücklicherweise so, dass das Punktesystem ist, wie es ist. Das heißt, wenn sich mal ein paar Leute dazwischen schieben, kann man auch sehr schnell Punkte aufholen. Pace-wise sehe ich da absolut Max Hellmann in der Lage. Der hat jetzt aber sehr wenig Punkte gesammelt. Am Ende des Tages wird man halt sehen müssen, ob Cativo auf Dauer eine Pace hat, wie jetzt beim zweiten Rennen. Wenn das der Fall wäre, sehe ich ich das am ehesten, wobei ich fast sage, wenn Kevin Peters jemand schlagen kann, ist es über die Konstanz Alexander Knežević, aber das werden wir auch sehen müssen. Der Vorsprung ist auf jeden Fall immens, den er schon hat. Ich glaube, es gibt immer Teams, die in der zweiten Reihe stehen und die in den Meisterschaften eben antreten, in denen es gleiches Material gibt. Und da hat sich Kostek einfach sehr hervorgetan, auch beim Entwickeln von neuen Talenten. Wenn ich einen Jan Berberich nenne, wenn ich einen Janis Wolborn nenne, es gab immer wieder solche Fahrer, die über Kostek groß geworden sind. Jalek Lapstich auch eine ganze Zeit lang, der dann 13 in der Königsklasse der damaligen eben die Chance bekommen hat mit Kostek. Und Kostek war immer so ein bisschen auch Anhängsel von einem anderen, einem größeren Team und ist jetzt ja auch in der TCG in der Form aktiv. Und ich glaube, das macht das Team aus, dass es, wenn man mal eine Real-Life-Referenz nehmen soll, so ein Team ist wie Sauber, was irgendwie überall, wo es mit gleichem Material und so weiter wo gekämpft wird, dass es da eben erfolgreich ist und ansonsten seinen Beitrag dazu leistet, junge Fahrer zu entwickeln.
Interlagos is known as one of the most famous circuits in the world of Grand Prix racing. The Autodromo Jose Carlos Pache circuit is not only known for its counterclockwise layout, but for its multitude of legendary races and memorable moments. Overtaking is possible at multiple spots here, including right before the famous Senna S. Drivers will need to be aware of anybody trying to catch them by surprise, as well as managing their tyres around a circuit that, at least in the AMC's case, tends to eat the tyres for breakfast. With all of that out the way, let's look at the starting grid for the third round of the 2022 American Monoposto Championship. Well, Gonzalez Cativo ends Kevin Peters' two-race pole streak by setting the fastest time in qualifying. Behind him, Alexander Knežević in P2, with Peters and Rustemeyer making up the second row, and Gabriel Peckley marking a great debut in 5th place ahead of Josh Cassar. Max Heyman and Gaggiano make up the 4th row. Aaron Curtis and Bartosz Kopeta line up in 9th and 10th respectively. Dittmer starts from 11th as a result of a 3-place grid penalty. Behind him, Jonathan Holohan on his debut, and Jacob Clark in his second outing for Super Gazelle Racing. Stefan Cerner also has a 3-place grid penalty, and closing out the field is Philip Fekler, who sadly suffered a server disconnect during qualifying. And so, I'll now hand over to your race commentator, Simon Court.
Thank you, Josh. Hello, everybody. It's Saturday. You know what that means. Another round of the American Monoposto Championship. This time, I'm happy to report that we didn't have any strange incidents throughout the formation lap, so we can look at a clean and hopefully entertaining start and race for you all watching this on YouTube. Looking at the start, we can see Gonzalez Cativo next to Alexander Knežević. The green flag drops, and we're underway. Now, it looks as if Gonzalez Cativo can actually defend his lead against Alexander Knežević. Peckley in the background trying to fight off Kevin Peters. Josh Cassar in the background. Somebody goes off, though. It seems as if the start has been rather clean, though. It seems as if Josh Cassar almost spins, almost ends his race. But as of right now, it seems as if everybody got through the first 2 corners. Very important for the race. We can see Alexander Knežević fighting with Kevin Peters, 2 of the championship candidates for this year. Behind them, people like Bartosz Kopeta, and we can see SCMM and Kostek drivers fighting with each other. But as of right now, Gonzalez Cativo defends his lead. Max Heyman fighting in the background with Dominic Rustemeyer, Gino Gaggiano fighting with Bartosz Kopeta. But so far, Gonzalez Cativo in the lead ahead of Alexander Knežević, Kevin Peters, Gabriel Peckley, and Bartosz Kopeta in P5. That would be a very satisfying result for the Schleppek driver. Now look at Aaron Curtis trying to go around the outside of Jonathan Holohan. Great battles in the midfield, and they do so successfully. And in lap 1, Kevin Peters already decides to take matters into his own hands and overtakes Alexander Knežević, does so beautifully, and is therefore now in 2nd position behind the veteran with the number 69. Now, what did I say about Bartosz Kopeta having to avoid mistakes? Well, he didn't manage to do that for more than 1.5 laps, which is disappointing considering that he was in a pretty good position for the race. But as of right now, it doesn't look as if Schleppek is going to score any points today. But it's only lap 2, and we still got a long way to go in this race, though it certainly must be disappointing for Bartosz. Josh Cassar had a troublesome start, almost ending his own race after only 2 corners, but he manages to overtake Max Heyman and is now in P6. Let's have a look at the standings for a moment. Gonzalez Cativo is ahead of Kevin Peters-Knežević in third, Peckley in fourth, Gaggiano in fifth, ahead of Kazar, Heyman, Rustemeyer, Curtis. Christian Dittmer is 10th. Now things go from bad to worse for Dominik Rustemeyer. He was in P8, but he lost multiple positions when he made this mistake and has therefore got to fight his way back into better points position. Certainly not the start that SCMM would have expected for themselves. Well, it seems as if things have gone from bad to worse for Philip Fekler. Not only did he have to start from the back of the grid after he had a disconnect in qualifying, he also binned it in the second sector and now has to limp back to the pits without a rear wing, which causes this bizarre incident, hitting Jacob Clark, costing him his front wing. Now, neither one of these drivers were penalized for the instance since it was considered a racing incident, the reason being that Philip Fekler was allowed to limp back to the pits even without a rear wing, but I'm sure that neither one of these drivers are going to be happy with this situation, especially considering that Jacob Clark seems to be quite far off Josh Kazar's pace, irrespective of incidents like these. Meanwhile, Max Heyman is fighting with Aaron Curtis on their second race in the American Monoposto Championship, makes a mistake, has to let Curtis through, and is now fighting with Christian Dittmer. Certainly not the start that he would have expected for himself, but let's see if he can fight his way back into better points positions. Now, in the meantime, debutant Gabriel Peckley decides to kind of make a name for himself and overtakes Alexander Knežević in the same turn where Lewis Hamilton almost lost the 2008 Formula One World Championship. Definitely an impressive maneuver considering that we didn't really consider people attempting to overtake other drivers at that point of the circuit. Peckley now in P3, behind him Knežević, Gaggiano, and a fast approaching Super Gazelle car with Josh Kazar at the wheel. Now, Gaggiano tried to overtake Knežević as well, but he makes a similar mistake to what happened to Dominik Rustemeyer at the beginning of the race. But he can continue, well, until a few moments after this when he actually bins it and ends his own race. Now, some people expected a safety car to be deployed right at this situation. However, Gino Gaggiano decided to continue and limp back to the pits, seeing as he was already in Sector 3, but race control advised him to not continue and therefore just park his car in the pits, avoid a safety car, but that spells the end to Gino Gaggiano's race. Now, what we've heard as rumor and innuendo in the paddock is that Gonzalez Cativo intended to run a 2-stop strategy while Kevin Peters decided to go for a 3-stop strategy. We're going to follow that situation and see who comes out on top and see if anybody else in this race can actually catch up to them. Well, Josh Kazar might still be in with a shout if he continues driving like this. An incredible overtake around the outside of the Bosnian veteran, and he is now in P4, just behind Gabriel Peckley. And guess what Mr. Kazar decides to do? He also tries to overtake Gabriel Peckley, but it doesn't work out just yet. But it looks as if Mr. Kazar might be rather competitive today, especially compared to what we saw of him 2 weeks ago in Rio de Janeiro. Now, after about 10 to 15 minutes, Gonzalez Cativo decides to pit, which puts Kevin Peters in the lead. Both Kazar and Peckley decide to pit at the exact same time for their first pit stops of the day. Now, Peckley's first pit stop went okay, but what didn't go so well was the fact that his engine decided to expire after his pit stop, and therefore he had to retire from his home race. Now, we're very happy to report that he pulled off the track, and therefore safety car was once again avoided, seeing as the car was not stationary on track. Though I'm sure some drivers in the field would have preferred a safety car to be deployed at this point, seeing as it might have given them a strategic advantage. With about 40 minutes to go, both Knežević and Kevin Peters decide to pit, with only Max Heyman staying out, possibly on an alternate strategy, ahead of Peters and a very motivated Josh Kazar, who's able to stay ahead of Alexander Knežević and is now fighting with Kevin Peters. And we're still unsure as to how many times these people are actually going to pit throughout the race. Now, Knežević might still be in with a shout for victory at this point, but not if he makes mistakes like these, where he spins, apparently because race control warned Jonathan Houlihan to let the leaders through and therefore avoid people being blocked, essentially. But Knežević was apparently surprised by the call and therefore spun and lost tons of time to Josh Kazar, Kevin Peters, and Gonzalez Cativo. Meanwhile, Aaron Curtis certainly won't be complaining about their position at this point. They're in P5, they're in a pretty good spot, and this is certainly a much better experience for the Irish driver than what Curtis experienced 2 weeks ago in Rio, when Robin Ide, let's just say, slightly altered Curtis' aerodynamic efficiency. Olohan's race ends early. He gets into the pits for his first pit stop. His engine also expires, and so it's the second engine-related retirement of the day. Disappointing for sure, but certainly a respectable effort by both Bravo Racing team drivers so far. Now, while Kativo is running away from the pack at the front, Mr. Heyman might employ a bit of team tactics in this instance, seeing as a bigger gap between Peters and Kativo would certainly be helpful for the leader right now, irrespective of which strategies him and Peters are on. But that strategic advantage doesn't last for too long, seeing as Peters decides to once again take matters into his own hands and overtake Max Heyman before the Senna S. Though that looked like a bit of a dangerous maneuver. Now, we're not sure whether or not Max Heyman tried to brake check Kevin Peters in this instance, but we can be for certain that Kevin Peters must be relieved to not have a potential Costech roadblock in front of him anymore. A bit later on, Curtis tries to defend their position against an angry Alexander Knežević, who tries to get back to the front group and therefore outbrakes themselves, loses a position, and Knežević just says, "Thank you very much," and is now back in P5. A lap later, and now Josh Kazar tries his luck overtaking Max Heyman. This, though, looks a bit more relaxed than what happened just a few moments ago with Kevin Peters and Max Heyman, at least in my humble opinion as a journalist. Well, Kativo is now in the lead ahead of Kevin Peters, Josh Kazar, and Alexander Knežević, seeing as Max Heyman decided to pit. However, at about the 30-minute mark, Heyman makes a crucial mistake, loses his front wing, just like something that actually happened to him last week, though we didn't show you on the broadcast, seeing as it happened 1 or 2 minutes before the race had actually finished. But this time it is certainly a far more crucial mistake from the Costech driver. And you can certainly say that except for Gonzalez Kativo's race, it's been quite a roller coaster today for the Costech boys. Fickler is retired at this point, Heyman's not in the position to win the race, and we're starting to hear murmurings that Gonzalez Kativo is actually on the wrong tires at this point. I don't know how that could have happened. It apparently happened 2 weeks ago in Rio, but right now, Gonzalez Kativo might actually be in a position to lose this race because he's on the wrong tires, therefore potentially not being able to extract the full potential from his car, and also potentially having to pit one more time than originally anticipated depending on how the race develops. Now let's look at both Josh Kazar and Gonzalez Kativo. After the second round of pit stops, both of them dropped back a bit and are now behind both Alexander Knežević and Kevin Peters. Therefore, these two are now fighting for P3, but depending on if this is their final pit stop or not, they might actually be fighting for the actual race lead at this point. Now Kazar trying his damnedest to overtake Gonzalez Kativo again. This might be the battle for race victory depending on how long these two can go, and it looks as if Kazar's ahead of Gonzalez Kativo, and he is. Kazar's now in P3 behind Kevin Peters and Alexander Knežević. Now, of course, you could argue that maybe these two shouldn't be fighting each other, seeing as they might be losing time to both Alexander Knežević, who's still yet to go into the pits for a second time, and Kevin Peters, but they do so regardless. Gonzalez Kativo trying to overtake Josh Kazar once again, but it doesn't quite work. Now, ahead of them is Christian Dittmer, whom they're about to lap, and look at him swerving out of the way to let them through. That was because race control told them specifically to get out of the way, not to block either one of these drivers, seeing as they might be in with a shout for race victory today. While the duel continues, Kativo around the outside of Josh Kazar. He's now back in P3. Brilliant duel between these two. Neither one of them giving an inch, even though you could argue that maybe they should. In the meantime, Peters has caught up to Alexander Knežević and decides to take matters into his own hands a third time today, overtaking the Odilo Racing team driver and therefore potentially avoiding any mingling between the TCG drivers, potentially playing a roadblock for Gonzalez Kativo. Just putting it out there and not making any assumptions or accusations. Once again, the duel between Gonzalez Cativo and Josh Kazar continues. Kazar this time trying to outbreak Gonzalez Cativo, and he does so very aggressively. Both of them outbreaking themselves, but Josh Kazar is now back in P3. Again, I wonder whether or not this is actually costing them time, seeing as both Kevin Peters and Alexander Knežević still seem out of reach. But then again, if both of them can go to the end on this exact fuel load, they really don't need to worry about Kevin Peters at this point, seeing as he surely has to pit at least one more time. Well, I don't know for how much longer Kazar will consider himself a potential race winner, seeing as he spins, hits the wall, and loses loads of time to both Gonzalez Cativo and Kevin Peters in front, though he might still be in with a shout if he can go to the end of the race on this fuel load. And now something incredible happens. Kevin Peters decides to pit for the third and final time, something we expected before the race. But then, even more bizarrely, Gonzalez Cativo decides to pit one more time. Now, as far as we're aware, he could have gone to the end of the race on this fuel up, but once again, he picked the wrong tires at the pit stop, and therefore, he had to come into the pits one more time to have competitive rubber on his car. And then Josh Kazar on the same lap has to pit as well, so all three leading drivers had to pit on the exact same lap. It looks as if Kevin Peters might be in a position to win the third race of the season, his third race in a row, simply based on the fact that Gonzalez Cativo picked the wrong tires and potentially wrong fuel loads as well 2 times in a row. So you can surely say that things have gone from bad to worse to absolutely horrendous for the Kostec boys today. They could have won the third race of the season, and if we want to be a bit blunt here, they chucked it right into either one of the lakes surrounding the Interlagos Circuit, which essentially translates to between the lakes in English. Now, after this calamity, let's have a look at the standings one more time to not get confused here. Kevin Peters is in P1 ahead of an angry and disappointed Alexander Knežević, who could have also been in with a shout for victory today if he hadn't made that mistake that we saw earlier, and maybe if he hadn't lost so much time in traffic. Behind him, Gonzalez Cativo in third, Josh Kazar in fourth. He'll be angry as well. Aaron Curtis certainly can't complain in fifth. Christian Dittmer is pretty relaxed in P6, a relaxed but certainly successful debut for the Falcon boys so far. Heyman's in 7th, Santa's in 8th, Bartosz Kopeta's still in 9th, ahead of the last remaining car on track, Jacob Clark, 3 laps down. But the race for P2 isn't over just yet, because Gonzalez Cativo overtakes Alexander Knežević, who isn't overly defensive in this instance. Again, both of these guys could have won the race today. Some might argue that Gonzalez Cativo could have won the race easily if it hadn't been for the pit stop screw-up. But then just before the race is about to end, Bartosz Kopeta decides to chuck his car into the wall, which causes the first safety car of the race to be deployed only a few minutes before the race finish. Now, remember, it's 60 minutes plus 1 lap, so the drivers right now aren't sure whether or not the race is going to finish behind the safety car, but the potential confusion of the safety car being called out so late causes Josh Kazar to spin, hit Alexander Knežević, and stall. He lets Alexander Knežević through once again, showing true sportsmanship in this instance, but the race is over for Josh Kazar, stalling his car, losing out on a potential podium today. Though I'm sure from a pace perspective, we can only be impressed with what we saw from Josh Kazar today, as well as Alexander Knežević and Gonzalez Cativo, but that doesn't change the fact that Kevin Peters is going to win the race, because just after this incident happened, race control announced that the race was going to finish behind the safety car. Definitely not the crescendo of a race finish that maybe Cativo and Knežević would have hoped for, considering it might have given them another shot at trying to overtake Peters. But irrespective of what could have, would have, or should have been, Kevin Peters makes it 3 for 3 and wins in Interlagos, and is now the absolute undisputed title favorite for this year's championship. But you could argue that he was just a little bit fortunate today. Though you could also argue he made the least mistakes out of anybody on the grid today, depending on your point of view. But let's take a quick look at the race results from Interlagos. Well, Kevin Peters makes it 3 for 3. He wins in Interlagos as well, ahead of Cativo, Knežević, and a very impressive Aaron Curtis in 4th. Christian Dittmer finished in 5th, ahead of Max Heyman and his teammate Stefan Zerner. Jacob Clark actually actually managed to get ahead of Josh Kazar in 8th just before the race finished behind the safety car. Bartosz Kopeta finishes in 10th despite his interesting incident. The top 12 were rounded out by Jonathan Houlihan and Dominic Rustemeyer, though both of them are only going to get half points, seeing as they didn't complete 75% of the race distance. In the Drivers' Championship, Kevin Peters now has a massive lead of 26 points compared to both Alexander Knežević and Gonzalo Cativo, and it looks as if these three are the realistic candidates for this year's American Monoposto Championship. The Teams Championship does look a bit more spicy, with Kostak, MPM, and Odilo fighting for the championship right now. The MS Falcons celebrate a pretty good debut with 16 points on board, even though you could still call it somewhat controversial. In any case, be sure to tune in 2 weeks when the American Monoposto Championship goes to Montreal, Quebec, Canada for the 4th round of this year's championship. Now, you're not going to hear from the 3 podium finishers today. Gonzalo Cativo seems to be a somewhat mysterious character, and we're still trying to get a grasp of him. Alexander Knežević was pretty annoyed after the race, and to be honest, we don't want to have the same drivers on the mic every single week, which is why we're going to look at a few midfield drivers next week and their experiences in Montreal. Until then, thank you for watching and keep racing.